Episode 257, The Importance of Animals. This is the Change Underground for the 24th of May 2021. I'm your host, John Moore. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. I'd like to start off this week with a big shout out to David, who bought me a coffee. Much appreciated, David, and yes, this show does run on coffee, so you are helping to fuel the work. There's a Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes and on the website. I might also point out that 10% of that coffee and all the courses that sell will be donated to the Bubugo Conservation Trust, link in the show notes, for their sustainable farming program. I love the idea that we can work together across the globe and make a difference in so many places. Now for our scheduled episode. I'm getting a little bit sick of urbanites saying things like, we can only save the world by going vegan. Now this has nothing to do with the ethics of veganism, vegetarianism, nor for that matter, omnivorism. It is to do with the complete lack of critical thinking and understanding of the real world. All their calculations appear to be based on the notion that meat is only and can only be produced in CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations. That grass-fed pastured meat is a niche product for the rich, but the great unwashed masses must move over to tofu or mung beans, for the good of the planet. The idea being that feedlots are the only way to produce meat, which is of course patently inaccurate, but that doesn't seem to matter because it doesn't fit the narrative. And the narrative goes something like this. We must all in the developed world lower our living standards, or the planet cooks. The sins of the past must be paid for by the present and the future. Now this is obviously based upon religious understandings rather than the application of the scientific method. And I'm more the second system myself. It's gotten to the point where PETA, the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, are yes, understandably campaigning against CAFOs, but they put out a statement here in Australia last week regarding our current mouse plague in Western New South Wales and parts of southern Queensland. In the statement, it was suggested that mice be collected alive and relocated away from the grain and fodder sources they are currently devouring. I noticed that the young lady wasn't putting her hand up for them to be delivered to her place. Now, clearly this statement is based upon ethical theory. You can't kill animals. Killing animals is wrong, rather than an understanding of what's actually happening on the ground. And even vegetarians are complicit in this sort of thing, because most of all of the sites that are being attacked are grain-based. So people that are living on their vegetarian dreams, the thought that no animals have been hurt, really need to get out of town and have a look at what happens in the bush. Now the footage I've seen, link in the show notes, started off with a cat sitting still with a mouse on its head, and the cat showing no interest whatsoever. Now the numbers of mice are truly mind-boggling, and so too is the amount and strength of the poison being used, but I suspect when you cut out a cancer you're going to take some good cells with it. And this farming community hit by this plague have this century been through drought, good rains, drought, fires, Chinese government trade attacks, COVID, and now mice. So yeah. But I digress, sort of. The PETA response to the mouse plague fits into a continuum with the we must all go vegan to save the planet argument. The separation of food production from the reality of most people in the developed world is pretty much complete. That's why the latter idea is accepted without question in media reports I've seen, but the PETA idea is just seen as a bit silly. And that lack of contact with agricultural reality has given a free hand to those wishing to push biological systems to their limits and beyond in an attempt to turn as many dollars, euros, pesos, rupees as possible. The industrialisation of ag, I've covered this in other episodes, 226, 245, 249 and 250 most recently. In another process that separated animals from much of food production. The regenerative ag movement, with its roots in better animal agriculture through biomimicry, copying in a fence system without natural predators the behaviour of herbivores on the grasslands of the world, Serengeti and the North American prairies being the most obvious. The idea is to bring really high grazing pressure by normal standards to really small areas and then letting the grassland rest for really long periods. In the same way that herds of bison moved across the prairie fairly quickly, and the grazing mobs on the Serengeti do the same thing. The predators in the domesticated situation are replaced with electric fences, and the wildebeest and bison replaced with cattle and, more lately, sheep. Now, this system has been integrated into crop production, so animals and plants working together, through the work of people like Gabe Brown, to give but one example. There's a link to Gabe's work in the show notes. On the suburban level, this integration is critical, small holdings too for that matter. There is something special about animal manures that works with soil so much better than compost. I know people go on about black gold and the powers of compost, but I've never found the stuff as powerful as animal droppings. Indeed, vermicompost is more powerful and efficacious for plant growth than straight compost in my experience. And the reasons are fairly obvious if we run a little thought experiment and think it through. Compost is powerful stuff. It is organic, and depending upon your inputs, and it grows soil much more quickly than geological processes. It is, though, a human construct. No other animal goes out of its way to create compost for soil improvement. Scrub turkeys may inadvertently create compost when they build up their piles of organic matter to start decomposing to keep their eggs warm. But they're not going out to actually build compost, they're going out to keep their eggs warm. Now, introducing manures has a much more potent effect, I find. Where, though, do we acquire these manures in a suburban context? The neighbours and local municipal authorities are unlikely to appreciate a steer in the back shed or a couple of piggies running around the backyard. Chooks, though, no hens in the rest of the world, are accepted in most places, as are rabbits and guinea pigs. And in just 24 hours, these little beasties will turn most kitchen scraps into rocket fuel for plants. You can compost these with the bedding from the animal's housing, or better yet, feed it through a worm farm. If you have enough material coming from the bedding and the droppings and whatnot to lay down a garden bed, then it's probably the best way to go. Miss all the other steps. Put cardboard on newspapers. People remember newspapers? Maybe. Down first, and then the manured bedding on top, and this will give you the best results on earth. But what to do with the continually reproducing beasties, I hear people say? Well, most suburban settings won't allow a rooster, so that solves the chicken problem, and you're still getting eggs. Guinea pigs and rabbits can be problematic. There does always appear to be a market for guinea pigs, though. As they're a good size for children, they'll take to handling happily, and they do produce a very dry manure. Rabbits, well, they tend to breed like rabbits, as it turns out. But there are ways around that too. You don't actually have to keep does and a buck. You could, in fact, just keep Angora rabbits for their Angora fleece. That still teaches responsibility for kids looking after animals, and these Angoras have to be brushed out regularly to remove the underfleece, which is the bit that is for sale and is currently selling on eBay, or was it Etsy, I can't remember which, for $245 a kilo, or about $111 a pound. That's not a bad return. You'd need a lot of rabbits to get to a kilo, but it does go a long way as well. So there's a possible side hustle there, with the garden feeding you and the rabbits, and their manures feeding the garden, and their fleeces paying for the annual holidays, or even a full-sized income if you've got enough of them, I guess. You need to run the figures on that, and I'm no business advisor, but it might be worth looking at. The other argument in favour of integrating animals into our gardens is the reason manures benefit plants. The plants and the animals evolved together, as did the soil microbiota. So long before humans appeared on the scene, plants and animals have been evolving together. Some plants with spines of chemical deterrents survived to reproduce when their siblings and cousins and whatnot did not. And so that particular group then continued to reproduce with spines and or chemical deterrents, and so were able to thrive. Now, some herbivores had harder mouths than other individuals in their population and were able to exploit these animal deterring spikes. And so then they put pressure on that species. And the dance continued through time, back and forth. And we only have to think back to our grandparents or maybe your great-grandparents' generations to remember horse-drawn milk floats and or garbage collectors and the fight over horse droppings for the garden. This may not be a memory passed on in your family history, but it happened. Neighbours refused to speak to neighbours for years over horse poo disputes. We knew that poo was the way to go, and we must get back to adding it to our gardens. And I reckon the best way to do that is to keep some small animals on your plot. Now, if you have any questions, thoughts or suggestions, we've got a Facebook group with a few of us there at the moment, and I've called it imaginatively and creatively the Change Underground podcast group. If you search on Facebook, you'll find it, or there's a link in the show notes. And in the transcript over at worldorganicnews.com/episode 257. So, let's get ourselves together, squeeze a bit more into our garden so we can get a lot more out, so that we may decarbonise the air and recarbonise the soil. Thank you all for listening, and I'll be back next week.